This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production.
The American dream, in the sense of you work extremely hard to provide the best education you can to your child, whether that means living in a community where there's an excellent public school system, whether it means saving up to send your child to private or parochial, elementary school, high school, what have you, and helping them achieve tutoring, extracurriculars to enter a top university. That was viewed as assimilation.
I'm your host, Raihan Salam. This summer, the Supreme Court will decide the Students for Fair Admissions cases that challenge the legality and constitutionality of affirmative action in higher education. Regardless of which way the justices rule, there remain several unanswered questions. Are racial preferences popular or unpopular? Will universities comply with a judicial mandate for equal treatment, or will they look for alternative ways to engineer diversity? And with the use of racial categories entrenched across American society, what is the next frontier for advocates of colorblindness? Renu Mukherjee is a Paulson policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute and a PhD student at Boston College. She's writing her dissertation on affirmative action and has written extensively about education policy and Asian American public opinion. And she joins us today to discuss the future of racial preferences in the United States. Renu, you've studied the history of affirmative action. You've studied public opinion of affirmative action. Can you tell us a bit about how popular the basic idea of affirmative action is with the broad American public?
So affirmative action, when actually explained to the public for what it accomplishes as a public policy, is extremely unpopular, and it has been historically. So the Roper Center is the largest database of survey questions, and it has collected affirmative action survey questions from 1976 all the way through currently 2021. And when you tell the American public that affirmative action in the context of both employment and higher education is a sort of preferential tip provided to applicants from certain racial minority groups, often at the expense of others, it's extremely unpopular. You have 3/4 and above of Americans saying they oppose such a policy. On the flip side, if you just use the benign phrase affirmative action and you don't explain what the policy in effect does on the ground, Americans are a bit more favorable to it because they associate the policy either with not knowing much about it or with just general issues of fairness and whatnot. And you see about more of a 45-55 or 50 to 50% split on the issue. So it really depends on if you're explaining to the American people what the policy in effect does.
Can you tell us a bit about how affirmative action is framed in the most favorable light? When you're looking back to President Johnson, for example, in the late 60s, there was this whole conversation about outreach, a conversation about making sure that qualified people were given opportunities. I wonder, if you could give us a sense of how the term's meaning has evolved over time.
Sure. So, in fact, like you said, when affirmative action was first instituted, the way it was described to the American public was providing greater access to Black Americans specifically in the areas of employment, education, particularly government employment and contracts. Because of discrimination this particular racial group had faced, first with slavery and then, of course, Jim Crow and the effects of that, seeing into the 60s, 70s, even the early 1980s. And so it was described as simply providing non-discrimination to this specific racial group. So employers could not just provide preferential treatment, kind of the reverse sort of affirmative action to white Americans, that you'd have to treat everyone fairly. And that's how the notion of fairness was attached to affirmative action, that it was simply going to provide equality or equal footing between white Americans and Black Americans at the time. But Johnson, in his famous Howard University address in the 1960s, gave the analogy of, a race and a starting line. And Black Americans had historically not been at the starting line of the race in the way that white Americans had. So when the gun went off, white Americans were able to be ahead of them. And so in his understanding, affirmative action was going to be used to remedy that discrepancy in the starting line between Black and white Americans. And that's, in effect, how affirmative action really functions in the United States today. But that's not, in fact, the framing that has been used with respect to this policy in portraying it to the American public. The framing has been around notions of equal opportunity, outreach, equal footing between the various races, and simply just pure non-discrimination. But again, that's not actually how the policy functions. And that's why you kind of see discrepancy in public opinion between how Americans feel if you just use the benign phrase affirmative action and how they feel if you use the phrase, say, racial preference.
One interesting dimension when you're looking at the history of affirmative action is that the ethnocultural demographic composition of the American population has changed quite dramatically since Roper was first tracking this data. One of those developments is that there's been a huge wave of immigrants and second-generation Americans. Has that influx of newcomers changed the politics of affirmative action at all? When you're looking at immigrants and second-generation Americans, do they have different views about racial preferences than other groups?
They definitely do. And if you see actually from the 1970s when polling on this began to today, Americans in certain polls are actually more favorable to the policy. And that could be attributed in part to the fact that second and third generations of Americans, so the children of immigrants, have a much more favorable view of racial preferences, even if they're adversely impacted by this policy, than their parents or their grandparents might. So public opinion is definitely shifted based on the influx of immigrants through U.S. history. And it's also kind of made the policy a little bit more complicated because when Johnson first really introduced it, when Kennedy introduced the notion of affirmative action and non-discrimination in his initial executive order in 1963, it solely applied to Black Americans. But now we see with the rise in immigration, for example, this policy being applied to Hispanic Americans and then wanting to apply it to other underrepresented minority groups like Native Americans. So it's made public opinion and just the politics surrounding this a bit more complicated.
Another dimension is that when you're looking at some of these emerging populations, these rising minority groups, rising in terms of their size, their electoral weight, et cetera, you do have some significant differences. For example, my understanding is that when you're looking at immigrants of Latin American origin and their descendants, they will oftentimes be beneficiaries of racial preferences. Whereas when you look at Asian Americans, in some domains, they might be beneficiaries, but in other domains, they might be disadvantaged by racial preferences that are designed to address underrepresentation of certain groups. Can you talk to us a little bit about that dynamic?
Sure. So Hispanic Americans or Latino Americans all by and large benefit from admissions tips or just racial preferences in the employment setting as well. But there are several Asian origin groups that don't benefit from affirmative action in the way that others might. So Vietnamese Americans, Bangladeshi Americans, for example, would receive an admissions tip under a system of racial preferences in higher education. Perhaps not to the degree that a Black American applicant, for example, would, but some sort of admissions tip, particularly if they're low income. But if you're an Indian American, for example, or a Chinese American, typically regardless of your socioeconomic status, you could receive a penalty under a system of racial preferences in higher education admissions. But back to the point about differences in generation with respect to immigrants, even Chinese Americans and Indian Americans who are being penalized by this policy on the ground, you see second and third generations of those Asian origin groups favorable to the policy, despite perhaps being adversely impacted by it, where again, their parents and grandparents would not be favorable to the policy.
Talk to us more specifically about Asian American opinion on racial preferences. This is a subject you've written about quite a bit for the Manhattan Institute, and it seems as though, despite the fact that, as you note, many Asian Americans are disadvantaged by these policies, there does seem to be quite broad support. At least that's the argument that's been advanced by many Asian American advocates. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. So the statistic that blew up with this about a year ago was that 70% of Asian Americans and a majority of the 6 largest Asian origin groups in the U.S. all favor race-conscious admissions in higher education. And that seemed a bit odd to me. When you look at just what's happening politically on the ground, also anecdotal stories, Chinese Americans, for example, have been mobilizing against the use of race-conscious admissions for quite some time, as early as 1983. in certain cases with respect to certain universities. So I thought, it's worth digging into what the question was used on the survey to elicit this response. And when I looked at the question that was put out to about 1,500 Asian American respondents, all in their native languages, so again, very clear, the question really had nothing to do with how affirmative action actually functioned. The question specifically was, do you favor or oppose giving affirmative action programs that provide Blacks, women, and other minorities with greater access to higher education? So who's not going to say yes to that? Who doesn't want to provide Blacks, women, and all other minorities with the opportunity to pursue some sort of higher education? So naturally, that yielded in total 70% of all Asian American respondents saying they favor affirmative action programs in college admissions, and also a majority of each of the 6 largest Asian origin groups in the U.S. What I found, though, was that a few years prior, the same polling organization sought to measure Asian American public opinion on affirmative action with a much more honest question. The second question wasn't perfect, but it asked respondents if they think affirmative action programs intended to increase the number of Blacks and other minorities on college campuses are a good thing or a bad thing. And support for affirmative action, when described as increasing the number of a particular racial group, plummeted. And it actually led to majority disapproval of the policy from Chinese Americans in response to that question in 2016. Around 63% of Chinese Americans said they opposed that policy. So again, it all goes back to whether you're going to honestly tell survey respondents how the policy works on the ground, or whether you're just going to use a benign phrase, affirmative action, or falsely describe the policy that's more in line with the pollster's particular preference.
Can you give us a bit more context about other survey questions that are out there? My recollection is that the Pew Research Center, for example, asks a pretty straightforward question about whether race should be a significant factor. Is your sense that that there's skepticism about racial preferences more broadly when you're asking that kind of straightforward question with these other surveys?
Definitely. And I argue that Pew's question that you referenced from April 2022, so a little over a year ago, is the best measure of recent American public opinion on the issue. Some criticism around this question is, for example, it doesn't use the phrase affirmative action. But the name of a policy, which is a contentious issue in and of itself a lot of the time, is much less important than just explaining to survey respondents, who typically are just, everyday Americans, they're not policy wonks, how this policy is going to affect them and work on the ground. So the Pew question listed 7 factors that are considered in American college admissions and asked respondents to explain whether they felt each listed factor was should be a major factor, a minor factor, or not a factor in college admissions decisions. In response to that, 74% of Americans said that race or ethnicity should not be a factor in college admissions, and a majority of each racial group that they considered, so whites, Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, they did not break up the Asian category, but a majority of each racial group also said race should not be a factor. And this is a very striking finding, because Blacks and Hispanics are beneficiaries of this policy. And about 60% of Blacks said they do not think race should be a factor, and 68% of Hispanics said that race should not be a factor. So when you actually explain to Americans, do you think that your skin color or your ethnic background should determine, even in part, whether you should be admitted to a college or not, 3/4 say no.
Renu, one issue I've always wondered about is the fact that most Americans, regardless of ethnicity, are not attending, for example, a selective college or university. Most people do not own businesses that are going to benefit from minority set-asides, et cetera. So when you're talking about the universe of people who are actually going to benefit from racial preferences in some tangible, concrete way, my sense is that it's somewhat limited. Do you think that that's part of what's going on here, that actually you're talking about a relatively elite group of people from this or that group, whether it's overrepresented, quote unquote, or underrepresented, that's kind of informing that broad skepticism. Just there are a lot of folks from minority backgrounds who are like, look, this is not something I'm going to benefit from. And it just doesn't sound quite right in principle.
I think that's largely the case. As you mentioned, affirmative action or racial preferences in higher education are really only effective at the elite schools throughout the United States. If you're just, and within that, I include elite public schools. So like University of Berkeley, University of North Carolina, but your average community college or your state school, this is not really an issue that you face. I think the reason it still elicits, though, such a strong response from the American public at large is that the notion of providing a benefit to certain groups and not others is kind of antithetical to just many of the philosophical notions of the United States, focusing on the individual as well as the group. And so I think that's why, if you explain in the simplest of terms to Americans, do you think that your race should determine whether you receive a benefit or not, it evokes quite a visceral reaction of, no, that's not okay. It's completely contrary to what we understand as Americans. And also, again, if you look at Asians, for example, many, specifically first-generation Asian immigrants, they immigrate largely to the United States in pursuit of notions of equality of opportunity, fairness, and this principle or ideal of the American dream. So then when you're told, your child might not receive a benefit because of your racial or ethnic background, it's sort of confusing that this is not what we were told. When we came here, we were told if we provide our children with the best education and they get, great test scores and grades and they work hard, that they'll be able to achieve, something of themselves. So I think, again, it does affect, like you mentioned, a very small subset of the U.S. population, but because it's antithetical to what we typically understand as Americans, it evokes a very negative response.
One issue you've surfaced in your reporting is that there does seem to be a gap between professional advocacy organizations among Asian Americans, organizations that are part of larger progressive civil rights coalitions, and more grassroots organizations. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. So in a forthcoming report, I looked at all of the advocacy groups that filed amicus briefs in the Students for Fair Admissions cases against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And I compared that to American public opinion on the issue. And I found that out of the total organizations, about 80% are on the pro-racial preference in favor of affirmative action side. And only about 15 to 20% are on the anti-affirmative action or anti-racial preference side. And that's extremely interesting when you, again, look at public opinion. So if you have 74% of Americans that say we don't approve of this policy, but 80% of the interest groups that are active on this issue represent the opposite opinion, then that has, regardless of how you feel about the policy itself, that has, some troubling, it raises some sort of, troubling ideas and whatnot about what interest groups or public interest organizations or advocacy groups are for, intended to represent the public. That's even worse with respect to the Asian American organizations specifically. So that Pew Research poll that we were just talking about from April 2022 found, again, it did not break down the Asian categories, but it found that Asian Americans as a whole, 63% oppose racial preferences. But about 92% of all of the Asian American advocacy groups that filed an amicus brief or joined an amicus brief in Students for Fair Admissions support affirmative action. Again, it's even more striking in the context of Asian American advocacy groups specifically, because there's data from Peter Arcidiacono, Duke economist, for example, that shows that Asian Americans can be penalized by this policy. So if you have 90-something% of the groups that claim to represent the interests of Asian Americans supporting a policy that has been shown empirically and anecdotally to penalize the constituency at issue, then that raises questions and could be a bit concerning.
Renu, I wonder, when you're looking at Asian American representation in elite higher education, in media, in other elite professions, you really do have this extraordinary rise. it seems as though despite this disadvantage that's introduced by race-conscious admissions, you still have people who kind of manage to get through that. And then oftentimes those Asian Americans in the most elite roles are oftentimes the most ardent defenders of racial preferences as opposed to being critics of them. And I wonder, what you think about that dynamic. Could it be that, Asian Americans who are nevertheless admitted to race-conscious, to these elite schools despite race-conscious admissions are basically, they see themselves as being in the winner's circle, and that therefore people who are critics of these policies are losers, and that there's something untoward about complaining about these policies when, again, there are people who, despite this disadvantage, kind of make it regardless?
Sure. So on that, I'll say two things. First, I agree with your assessment of this. I think part of it is, well, I wasn't adversely affected by race-conscious admissions. I got into Harvard. I got into the University of North Carolina. So this notion,
and therefore it must be meritocratic. It must be a totally fair system. And yeah.
And what's funny about that is actually the New York Times had an op-ed a few weeks ago from a senior Asian American female at Yale. I believe she was Chinese American. And she made this exact argument in her op-ed, which is the first point of the op-ed was, well, not everybody who has certain grades and a perfect score on the SAT deserves admission to Yale. The second point was, how can there be discrimination if I'm from an Asian subgroup, one of the more, quote unquote, elite Asian subgroups in terms of socioeconomic status, education status, for example, and I was accepted to Yale. So therefore, there can't be any sort of discrimination. It's kind of like your blinders are on. The second point that I'll mention is many of these colleges and universities, through the larger sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, have put forth the sort of Rainbow Coalition Jesse Jackson argument that if you're part of any sort of racial minority group, then you kind of have linked fate together. It's worth everybody banding together and fighting, whether it's white supremacy or systemic racism or what have you. And so then you see many Asian Americans that have been shown, specifically if you're Indian or Chinese, to be penalized by this policy. Nevertheless, they're accepted to these schools through a lot of this, racial preference, DEI programming, then come to hold this view that we are in the same position as Latinos and Blacks, and we all have to band together, then rise to further elite circles in American society. So I think it's those twofold points, that one, I won out, so quote unquote, in this game of college admissions, it is a zero-sum game. And then two, I've experienced all of this DEI programming. I have to align myself with other racial minorities. And so therefore, I'm in support of this policy.
I'm going to ask you for your impressions. And I realize that there likely isn't very hard data on this, but I am curious. You talk about linked fate, and there's one version of linked fate which follows this Rainbow Coalition logic. The kind of all people of color have this unified interest. There's another version of it, which is that let's say you're a person of Asian origin who has very strong ties to a specific ethnic group, a specific ethnic community, and your sense of linked fate runs in the opposite direction. Even if I'm someone who's managed to overcome the obstacles put in my way by race preferential admissions, I still feel solidarity with a larger group. Do you see patterns like this in terms of how people respond to racial preferences? Is it the case that people who are more assimilated, let's say, into the kind of larger upper middle class, into the kind of liberal sensibilities of professionals, that they're more likely to be pro-affirmative action than people who are less assimilated, in the sense of having stronger ethnic ties? Or is that not really how it works?
I think that's exactly how we're seeing it work today. Before, assimilation for Asian Americans meant the American dream, in the sense of you work extremely hard to provide the best education you can to your child, whether that means living in a community where there's an excellent public school system, whether it means saving up to send your child to private or parochial elementary school, high school, what have you, and helping them achieve tutoring, extracurriculars to enter a top university. That was viewed as assimilation and also being extremely patriotic. Now assimilation to the middle and upper, particularly the upper middle class, revolves around embracing sort of the larger, diversity, equity, and inclusion arguments. We're seeing incorporated into all aspects of mainstream public life. So corporate America, higher education, elite high schools, really the public school system as well. And so assimilation means saying, maybe perhaps realizing at home and internally, this policy is going to adversely impact my child, but I don't want the parent-teacher association to be against me, so I'm going to vocalize that I oppose this policy. And then I'm going to get as much tutoring and outside consultants as I can to help my Chinese American child get into a good college, but I'm not going to be vocal about that. So I do think, again, support for this policy and just the view of whether you support it or not is based, like you say, on sort of your class status and what have you. But I think even those that are perhaps vocal about the policy for fear of not wanting to be ostracized by society or your peers, especially if you're in a more blue area of the country, as many of these Asian immigrant groups are, you also are kind of aware of how this policy works on the ground. So then you're also taking measures kind of on your own to make sure your child has the best opportunity.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that what we might think of as a traditional work ethic, traditional values around achievement and studying hard, et cetera, that those things are countercultural in a way among people who are upwardly mobile. They might still do the things that are associated with achievement, but you certainly don't celebrate them in a way because that actually might hurt your chances in this kind of meritocratic contest.
Exactly. And you see that, for example, in college admissions essays. My younger sister recently applied to college, and out of curiosity, I was reading what some of the application prompts or essays asked for. And it's not necessarily anymore about, if you could. I remember when I was applying to college, it was, if you could come up with one invention, what would it be and why? It's now more asking, what's the time you faced adversity or discrimination, or what's an unfortunate experience you have, or how do you want to further diversity? How do you want to further equity? Those are the questions that are being asked. So if you as a parent or as an applicant or a student are seeing these questions, you kind of know that this is what colleges, also selective high schools, for example, private high schools want to see. And so you're going to play to that. Whereas if you probably in response write your essay, about how hard work and equal opportunity are great American values and should be pursued, and the prompt asked you to discuss equity, I don't see you getting accepted necessarily. So I think, yeah.
I wonder, tell me about the role of Chinese Americans specifically. In your reporting, it really does seem as though Chinese Americans, particularly Chinese American immigrants, have been particularly assertive and vocal in some of these policy battles, including the battle over racial preferences. Is there some reason why Chinese Americans have been at the forefront?
So Chinese Americans largely noticed in the state of California in the late 1970s and early 1980s that discrimination against Asian Americans, at the time what was largely Chinese immigrants, was happening at some of these more elite schools. And the initial focus of this was actually at the University of California, Berkeley. There was one professor, I can't recall what department, I think perhaps anthropology, and he was on just a faculty admissions committee, and he had noticed the admit rate of Asian Americans just going down drastically, despite the fact that applications were at an all-time high. And he started digging into this and kind of making noise and bringing it to the administration's attention at UC Berkeley. And this was around 1983. At the same time, really around the same time, you had an undergraduate, also a Chinese American student at Harvard, who worked in the admissions office. And she had actually discovered through just giving tours and sitting in on meetings as a student representative that the same thing was happening, that Asian American applications, which were largely, Chinese American at the time, were rising drastically while the admit numbers were either plummeting or staying the same. And she ended up writing her senior thesis at Harvard on this. And so Chinese Americans, as a result of that, were the first to notice that this was going on. At UC Berkeley, at Harvard around the same time. This also happened at Brown and Princeton. And so they were at the forefront of this, just simply noticing that this was taking place.
I also wonder if there's some way in which group size matters. That is, when you have a diaspora, when you have an ethnic community that's sufficiently large, then, you may well have people who quote unquote defect from the group and the perceived group interest, but there are enough people who are insiders within the group that solidarity winds up being more powerful. Does that make sense to you? I mean, could that be part of why the group has become more politically active?
Yes, I think that's a major part of it. I mean, I think Indian Americans are supposed to surpass Chinese Americans in terms of the largest Asian origin group, where they're currently on track to. But as of now, Chinese Americans, and actually for quite some time, have been the largest Asian origin group in the United States. And so if a majority of Chinese Americans are opposed to this policy, then regardless of whether it's perceived to be, primarily Chinese Americans that are involved on the opposition side to racial preferences, it can seem that way, even if you have, say, Korean Americans, for example, Japanese Americans that are also opposed to this policy. Chinese Americans have largely been at the forefront, like you mentioned, simply because of their size and their numbers. And when this all began in California, I mean, there were so many Chinese Americans in California at the time and still today. So it made sense numbers-wise as well.
That's fascinating. So let's talk about the Supreme Court decision. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but there certainly is a lot of educated guessing going on around what a decision might look like. So can you walk us through the different possibilities? For example, how likely is it that this is going to be basically a, Grutter redux? Back then in the 90s, many people expected that affirmative action would be overruled. It didn't quite happen. Are we looking to a similar outcome now, or do you think that this time is going to be different?
I think this time will be a bit different. I'm not sure if I think it will if the opinion will be airtight in the sense that it will make explicit that any sort of racial preference is unconstitutional and also against Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the reason I say that is because I was a little disheartened isn't perhaps the correct word, but a little sort of taken aback in oral arguments back in October. There was much discussion about the difference between what Amy Coney Barrett described as, quote, a check-the-box consideration of race and then a more holistic consideration of race. And this actually took up a decent amount of time of the oral arguments, whereas it seemed as though someone who's as ideologically conservative or an originalist like Amy Coney Barrett, bringing up the possibility that she might find it concerning if an applicant is not allowed to, for example, mention his or her race at all in describing family background, whether immigration story, and any sort of adversity that really formed who they are as a young person that's tied to their race or ethnicity. So she said she was a bit uncomfortable with that, it seemed. But she understood outlawing a check-the-box consideration of race, for example, on the common application. Are you Asian? Then the Asian category breaks down. Are you Chinese? Are you Indian? Are you Black? So she seemed to be against that. And what's interesting is that Ketanji Brown Jackson, it seemed as though she was fine with both considerations of race, but she asked a very similar question to Amy Coney Barrett. She gave the analogy, if you have two applicants, one is white, one is Black. Both have been living in North Carolina for 5 generations. And the white student would be able to write in the application essay, I want to go to UNC because I'd be the 5th generation in my family to go. She said the Black applicant couldn't then write an essay that said, I want to go to UNC because I'd be the first in my family to be able to go to UNC. Because of slavery, historic discrimination, no one else in my family has been able to. And she said she found that possible dichotomy troubling. That's quite similar to what Amy Coney Barrett was asking the attorneys representing students for fair admissions about. And it's because of that line of argumentation that I think the court will rule in favor of students for fair admissions, but I'm unsure of how clean the opinion will be in opposing racial preferences.
Fascinating. So let's delve into this a bit more. If you are not explicitly proscribing any reference to race whatsoever, is your view that you will go right back to square one, and that basically, even if it's not about checking a box on the common application, that applications will be scrutinized to identify information about a student's race or ethnicity, and that in turn will be used to try to engage in this kind of racial balancing of the admitted students?
Yes, I think college admissions officials, from just conversations I've had with individuals, already screen applications in that way. And I think there will be a greater attempt to do so, particularly through an increase of college essay prompts. It's going to be extremely interesting to see what various, especially the elite schools, make their application questions for the upcoming fall 2023 admission cycle. Because if the question is, for example, describe a time in which you overcame adversity, and the court's opinion has made it so, well, you can't have check the box racism, but you can't have more of a holistic understanding. The advocates and Students for Fair Admissions that represented Students for Fair Admissions said, their response to the Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson questions were, you can, as an applicant, mention your race. It's just the college admissions team. The decision to admit you can't turn on race. It has to turn on the action of overcoming adversity. Now, that theoretically is correct, but on the ground, practically, it's an extremely fine line. So college admissions officials can look at that and include essays, for example, where they can screen for, if you overcame adversity and you mentioned that you're from an underrepresented racial group in the United States, they can, in theory, provide you with an admissions tip that they would not give to, say, a white applicant. So I think there will be attempts in that way, through essay questions, for example, to screen applicants according to racial and ethnic status.
This seems incredibly thorny because, given that there's necessarily some degree of subjectivity in the analysis of this kind of admissions packet, it's not clear how you police whether or not there's an undue emphasis on racial identity. I wonder how you think about that and how others who are looking at, call it the next frontier of the battle over racial preferences are thinking about it.
I think there has to be some way. Well, first, I think the Students for Fair Admissions decision, if it strikes down race-conscious admissions, I think it's going to require years and years of litigation. I'd go as far to say, maybe in my mind, 8 to 10 years of litigation to really see the racial preference system in higher education decline. The way to do that is there's going to future plaintiffs will somehow have to prove that through a quote unquote race neutral system, the colleges are still in fact conducting their admissions in a way that has a negatively disparate impact on Asian American and white applicants. I'm not sure if that would be through some sort of, discovery process via emails, or just being able to show based on admissions data that is released, which is quite hard to do. So I agree that it's going to be thorny and quite complicated, and it's going to take years of litigation if we actually want to see the racial preference system decline.
Students for Fair Admissions, in their lawsuit, were advancing this idea that you could continue to achieve racial diversity without explicit racial preferences. You've written about this, you've talked about this, and I wonder if that actually gets you into this weird place where essentially what you're saying is that we will use various potentially very heavy-handed methods to engineer the class that are not themselves race-based, but that are designed to get you to a certain racial outcome. Can you tell us a bit about how Students for Fair Admissions approach this and what you think of as the implications?
Yeah, so Students for Fair Admissions, while they advocate for overturning Grutter, which in 2003 was so initially in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978, that court case is the court case in which the whole notion of diversity as being a reason that schools can use race as a factor, that's where that came about. But it was just judicial dicta at the time, meaning that it was just in a plurality opinion. It didn't receive a majority endorsement. That decision was then endorsed in 2003's Grutter versus Bollinger, in which 5 justices said, yes, we agree with that holding from 1978, that diversity is a compelling interest. So while Students for Fair Admissions has asked the court to overturn Grutter, which would presumably mean not only that you can't use race and ethnicity as factors in admissions, but also that diversity is not a compelling interest. They've put that idea forth, but at the same time, they've said, here is one race neutral way that they called in their brief Simulation D that would still lead to racial and ethnic diversity. So that simulation essentially was getting rid of racial preferences, but providing an admissions tip based on socioeconomic status. And what Students for Fair Admissions, through the work of their expert witness, Dr. Arcidia Kono, found was that by providing an admissions tip to low-income applicants, it would decrease the white admit rate. It would increase in a combination the Hispanic and Black admit rate. It would increase the Asian American applicant admit rate, and then the socioeconomic diversity of Harvard would increase drastically. And it's Harvard and most elite schools are not socioeconomically diverse now, and so that's what they put forth. So it's interesting because if the court overturns Grutter in this case, it'll be interesting to see if they overturn the entirety of Grutter, which would presumably overturn the notion that diversity is a worthwhile thing for colleges to pursue. If they do that, then the notion of an admissions tip based on something like socioeconomic status is irrelevant in some way. It would be, college admissions perhaps used to be based purely on merit. But if the court solely overturns the idea of race being considered, but still says, diversity is a laudable goal for a college or university, you just have to pursue diversity in a race-neutral way, then I envision you'll see colleges adopting socioeconomic based tips, top 10% plans, the other race-neutral things of this sort that, yes, on their face are race-neutral, but do in fact have a high correlation with race and ethnicity to achieve this idea of diversity.
It's interesting. I wonder if one way to think about it is that Students for Fair Admissions is telegraphing that you will not be punished as a selective higher education institution for seeing diversity as a laudable goal, but you will not be mandated. You will not be required to do so. You will not be punished if you have a student body composition that does not reflect the larger American population. Does that make sense? I mean, I guess when you're looking at the status quo, and it's not just the Supreme Court precedents. You have accreditation organizations. You have a range of other forces. You have federal law that grants subsidies to Hispanic serving institutions, that basically tilt you towards policies that involve the kind of racial engineering of your student body. Could it be that in the wake of a Supreme Court decision, you'll have a world where what we're saying is that you're not required to do that, and if you decide to go a different way, you will not be punished. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and I actually think unless the Supreme Court decision is so clear that it outlaws, then really does away with accreditors having diversity requirements, with the government programs that provide additional federal funds to schools that say are 25% Hispanic and whatnot. Unless the court's opinion is that explicit, I envision we're actually going to see an amplification of these other efforts. So when California outlawed race-conscious admissions, for example, you saw kind of the DEI apparatus in the state go out of control. And I envision that happening in other avenues as well, through accreditation, through these additional federal funding programs, unless, again, the court opinion is written in a very broad way.
Some advocates of preserving racial preferences make a quite straightforward argument, which is that, look, when you're looking at Simulation D advanced by Students for Fair Admissions, this is a world in which, you get diversity, but also average SAT scores go down. There are other dimensions in which, let's say the results of a more merit-based approach, would look further and further off, from the outcomes you'd get. And that if you just have racial preferences, look, the argument could be, let's not beat around the bush. What we want to do is achieve racial balancing. This is the most straightforward way to do it. If we can't do it directly by directly targeting race, we're going to do it indirectly in a way that winds up being very, quote unquote, inefficient from the perspective of getting the class that has the highest board scores, the highest GPAs, et cetera. I wonder what you think about that argument.
So it's interesting because this was that argument that you just put forth was Clarence Thomas's argument in his dissent in Grutter. And he said, listen, colleges and universities have to decide what your ultimate goal is. If your ultimate goal is to be an elite university based on merit in terms of if you want to maintain your extremely high GPA cutoff, if you want to maintain an SAT, ACT standardized testing requirement cutoff that is in the 90th, 99th percentile, etc., then you're going to have to sacrifice some of this racial and ethnic diversity goals that you might have in mind. On the flip side, if your ultimate goal is to have an incoming class each year and a larger student population that mimics the overall racial and ethnic composition of the United States as a whole, then you, if you're going to be honest and truthful, have to lower your GPA and SAT requirements, because it's just not possible that you can simultaneously have your ideal set of racial balance and then maintain what you want your GPA and standardized testing scores to be. So colleges and universities, to get around that, have of course sort of, fixed their GPA and testing requirements at one level for certain racial groups and at other levels for other racial groups. And we've seen this in terms of the data that Harvard and the University of North Carolina had to provide, specifically Harvard, at trial. And so we see that they're doing this, that racially engineering their incoming classes is requiring them to engineer also and work around their, average testing scores that they put out on their website for interested applicants. And so they're going to have to choose one or the other. They might continue, again, depending on how the court writes their decision, trying to achieve both. But basically, what Clarence Thomas said in Grutter was, these two ideals, you can't have a perfect version of either ideal. You either have some of one and some of the other, or you have one or the other. You can't have a perfect version of both.
You mentioned California, and California is a state that in the 1990s essentially banned racial preferences, and that ban was reaffirmed quite recently, despite a very heavy, aggressive push not to do that. Nevertheless, when you're looking at the state's selective public universities, as you mentioned, it sure does seem as though you have the reintroduction of preferences through the back door. Can you talk to us a bit about how that's worked and what we might learn from that experience?
Sure. The main way that preferences have largely reintroduced themselves in the University of California system has been through the elimination of standardized testing. So in 2020, the residents of Californians voted by a larger margin to prohibit the consideration of racial preferences in contracting, public employment, higher education, and the state system than they did when the ban was first introduced in 1996. And what the University of California Board of Regents did in 2021, a year later in response to that, was not only go test optional. So test optional schools are those in which applicants can submit their SAT and ACT scores, but they're not required to. The University of California Board of Regents voted to outlaw the consideration of standardized testing altogether. So in 2021, the UC schools actually became test blind, meaning if you're applying to the University of California at Berkeley and you got a perfect score on the SAT and you submit it, they won't even consider it as a part of your application. The reader won't even see it. And that elimination of standardized testing has allowed them to maintain not the exact same degree of racial balance. I mean, you see all these reports that came out, and actually UC system filed an amicus brief in Students for Fair Admission saying, while racial diversity increased as a whole across the system, it decreased specifically at Berkeley and UCLA, which are considered sort of the two crown jewels of the UC system. And so they eliminated testing. And these are kind of just the average test scores of the racial groups on the ACT. So in 2021, out of 1,600 being a perfect score, the average test score for Asians was a 1239, for whites an 1112, for Hispanics a 967, and for blacks a 934. So with that sort of data in mind, UC voted to go test blind. And I think we can look to that and use that as a map for where colleges and universities, elite schools are going to go in the aftermath of a potential strike down of affirmative action. It's going to be through eliminating standardized tests.
I'm curious what you see happening next. Assuming that Grutter is overruled, assuming that we have this new, perhaps confusing, but this new regime governing race preferential admissions, trying to limit race preferential admissions, where do you see advocates of colorblindness going next? At City Journal, the Manhattan Institute has been publishing a ton of work on, for example, minority contracting. You've written a great deal about high school admissions. There's now a set of emerging battles over graduate school admissions. I wonder, what do you see as the kind of lowest hanging fruit? What are the other domains where advocates of colorblindness might apply pressure next?
I think all the different, in the context of higher education, for example, areas that you listed are where the natural next response is to go to. And this, again, largely depends on if the court says our opinion applies not just to undergraduate admissions, but to graduate school, where it would have more weight because you require a more specialized technical knowledge in medical school, for example, than you do at a liberal arts four-year college. Does it apply in K through 12 as well? And so, for example, Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax County, Virginia, recently opposed at one of their magnet school at Thomas Jefferson, which is a magnet school, the reworking of the merit-based admissions process to a lottery system that had an extremely adverse, disproportionate effect on Asian Americans. They won at the district court level. They lost yesterday in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they're going to appeal to the Supreme Court. So unless the Supreme Court next month comes out and says, this opinion applies to K through 12, higher ed, and graduate school, I think that's the next area on the horizon in the context of education for advocates of colorblind admissions is K through 12 schools, elite schools, and then also graduate programs. And then you still have minority contracts that are being awarded on the basis of racial preferences. We saw this happen with respect to COVID-19 vaccine distribution, certain racial preferences. And so it has affected all other areas of public life. And so I think, whether it be employment, K through 12 admission, I think these are all sort of areas that advocates of colorblindness should have a foot through the door in, because this is really, in my mind, the Supreme Court decision, just the beginning of a debate or fight that's going to take years and years and years to fully see colorblindness restored.
What do you think of the view that it is racial categories themselves that need to be subject to scrutiny? The United States has really entrenched racial classifications in a number of different ways, both through civil society but also through government. You have these official census categories that you've written about quite a bit that seem to have taken on a life of their own, these pan-ethnic categories that are, in a sense, fictive. They're invented, but that have really shaped advocacy organizations. They've shaped our political life. Do you believe that is an area that should be addressed? Should conservatives be calling for the census to roll back the use of these categories, or is that too radical a step given how widely used they are?
I don't foresee a situation in which the various racial categories would be walked back to a lesser degree than they're used now. In fact, the Biden administration specifically is working currently on expanding these racial categories to be a bit more technical and specific and inclusive. And they actually just ended their public comment period on this. So, for example, they are disaggregating the Asian American racial category in a way that individuals would be able to check the box of whether they're Indian, Bangladeshi, Chinese, Korean. They're planning to disaggregate the African American / Black American category into whether you are a descendant of a slave or not. That has provoked a sort of controversy, because could you say being the descendant of a slave a racial or ethnic identity, or is it more of a socioeconomic or a political identity? So that's something they're considering. And then, of course, the Asian American category makes really no sense at all. But the Hispanic category has kind of become sort of a catch-all for many different racial ethnic groups. Hispanic it's an ethnic category. It's not even a racial category. So breaking that down and just saying, if you're Latino, are you Colombian? Are you Mexican? And then separately checking, do you also identify as Hispanic? Because the Biden administration put forth the idea that you could be Black and you could also be Hispanic, but you have to pick one or the other. So I don't necessarily see less categories.
Interesting, because the Hispanic category has been treated for some time now as an ethnicity rather than as a racial group. There have been advocates who've wanted Hispanic to be treated parallel to other racial groups. So has the Biden administration actually embraced that idea now that, the Hispanic category is going to be something that will be parallel to white, Black, Asian, et cetera?
That was my understanding, sort of reading. I actually think it's the first point that you made. Based on the drafts that they put forth for public comment, it seemed as though Hispanic was going to be categorized in a way that, say, if you identified as being Black, but say you were like Afro-Dominican is an example that's put forth. And that way you could check Black and you could also check Hispanic to make it, whereas now you kind of have to pick one or the other. So none of this is final, but yeah.
What about the Middle Eastern North African category that has garnered some discussion? Is that something that's still a live possibility?
Yes, it is. And on the guidance that the Biden administration put forth for public comment, that itself was a separate category itself that you could check Middle Eastern North African, because before it's been, incorporated into the broader Caucasian category. And what's interesting is in some discussions I've had with individuals that are involved in college admissions, colleges will sometimes consider Middle Easterners as white, sometimes as Asian, sometimes perhaps even as Black if it's falling under, the North African category. So that has made largely very little sense. But in this guidance that was put forth for public comment, this draft, that was also a separate category, was Middle Eastern North African.
It's interesting. I could see this both ways. One could argue that the further disaggregation of these categories could actually be a healthy development insofar as when you're looking at national origin, this is something that has real heft. This is more closely tied to, call it linguistic differences. These are just, real categories in a way that could actually break the stranglehold of some of these kind of larger categories that don't have the same kind of social meaning. I wonder, what you think about that, because, could it be that actually the Biden administration's effort to disaggregate these categories could actually lead to a kind of healthier conversation about ethnicity and race, or do you think that it's heading in the wrong direction?
Sure. So I think that the effort behind, they've been quite transparent, the Biden administration. I think it's, if you want to tailor providing some racial preferences, not just in higher education, but in government and employment and contracting, or just areas of American public life. If you are able to now kind of, look at, for example, socioeconomic data and see why, while in their mind, Indian Americans might not need a racial preference stamp, but Vietnamese Americans might. If you break up the Asian American category, then that just makes your life a whole lot easier, and you're no longer susceptible to criticism, for example, from Asian American advocacy groups saying, we actually support racial preferences because there are many Vietnamese, Cambodians, for example, that need some sort of government assistance, that need a boost that Black Americans have historically received in the U.S. So in that sense, it could be deemed as a positive. Where I could see the case being quite negative is that, again, this just allows for further classification of individuals, for it to provoke sort of, further animosity between different racial and ethnic groups. Of course, if you have, for example, in a city, many different racial and ethnic groups living together, and you provide in a very small, tight space, and you're providing preferential treatment to some people and not others, of course, it's going to provoke feelings of animosity and tension and sort of be antithetical to cooperation. And so in that sense, I could see this backfiring.
Renu, it seems that you are not anticipating that a Supreme Court decision in the Students for Fair Admissions cases is going to represent the end of contentious conversation about race in American public life. So, is your sense that this is just going to be pretty inconclusive and that we'll be having very similar conversations 5 years from now about race preferential admissions and much else?
I think we definitely will still be having similar sort of conversations about race and ethnicity and just the notion of awarding preferences based on race and ethnic background. I think that as any sort of Supreme Court strike down simply saying that this policy is antithetical to the Equal Protection Clause to the Civil Rights Act will be important in a symbolic nature, and it will in fact represent what 3/4, 74% of Americans believe should be the case of in the United States with respect to college admission. So I think it will be significant, and I'm hoping I'm pleasantly surprised, and whichever justice writes the opinion first, that a majority votes to strike down Grutter, affirmative action, and, writes the opinion in an airtight way in which it will be quite hard for the federal government, for colleges and universities to circumvent the decision. But I'm not sure if it's possible for the court to anticipate all the ways in which higher education, the federal government, corporate America, et cetera, that are all in favor of racial preferences are going to try to mobilize in opposition to a potential strike down. And so for that reason, I think we might be having a similar conversation 5 years down the road.
Renu, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights.